I never thought the lake would turn against me. For 23 years, the water had been my sanctuary, a place where the noise of the world couldn't find me. My cabin stood at the edge of Willowmist Lake, a mirror of blue cradled by pine and stone, far from the city, far from the people who measured worth in square footage and brand names. It was my father's before it was mine, and his father's before him. Every board, every nail, every shingle was laid by someone who believed peace couldn't be bought. It had to be built. When I inherited it, I swore I'd protect it. Not just for me, but for the memory of the hands that built it. That promise meant something. Until the HOA came along. They called themselves the Willowmist Lakeside Homeowners Association, a collection of retirees and suburban warriors who'd turned community management into a form of quiet tyranny. At first I didn't mind them much. They stayed on their side of the lake, and I stayed on mine. But things changed when Margaret Halbrook became president. If ambition had a face, it would look exactly like hers, sharp, polished, and always calculating. She had that suburban kind of confidence that came from getting her way too often. Her designer sunglasses always hid her eyes, but not the disdain that leaked from her tone. The first time we met, she introduced herself as if she were some sort of monarch. "You must be Mr. Caldwell," she said, stepping onto my dock without being invited. "I'm Margaret Halbrook, president of the Willowmist HOA. I just wanted to make sure you're aware of the new property guidelines." I remember looking at her manicured hand and then at the clipboard she was carrying like a weapon. "I'm not part of the HOA," I said. "My property's been privately owned since before the association existed." Her smile didn't falter. It just got tighter. "Well, that's technically true," she said, dragging the word technically out like she was trying to dissolve it. "But we do expect cooperation. The community works better when everyone's on the same page." I told her politely that my page was written long before hers. That was the beginning of it. A slow war fought with letters, meetings and rules that didn't apply to me but were enforced anyway. She hated that she couldn't control me, that my cabin stood as a reminder of a time before her empire of regulations. And so she tried to push her way in, one demand at a time. It started small. "Your dock doesn't meet HOA safety standards. Your fence is too rustic for the lakeside aesthetic. You should consider joining. It'll make things easier." But I didn't budge. I knew her kind, people who mistook authority for ownership. Then one summer, when the tourists started flooding in and the lake shimmered under the July sun, she crossed a line I couldn't ignore. I woke up one morning to the sound of car doors slamming, several of them. From my window, I saw people unloading coolers, towels, and inflatable kayaks in my driveway. I stepped outside, half expecting they'd taken a wrong turn. But then I saw Margaret standing on the dock with a glass of something pink in her hand, waving like it was her property. "Oh, there you are," she said cheerfully. I told them you wouldn't mind. "There's some friends of mine visiting for the weekend, and your cabin's lake access is perfect for them." For a second I thought she was joking. "You told them they could use my lake cabin?" I asked slowly. "Oh, don't be so dramatic," she said, laughing. "It's just for the weekend. You're not even here half the time." I felt my pulse thrum in my ears. "Margaret, this is private property. You don't get to decide who—" "Don't raise your voice at me," she snapped, her tone changing like a whip crack. "This is community property by extension. We're all supposed to share the lake, aren't we?" The way she said share, it wasn't about kindness. It was about control. I told her to pack up and leave. She refused. Her guests looked at me awkwardly, unsure whether to side with her or common sense. I could feel something burning inside me. Years of quiet compliance boiling over. "You step off this dock right now," I said, voice low but steady. "And you tell your guests to get off my land before I call the sheriff." Her smile froze. The moment cracked and the mask slipped. "You'll regret that," she said coldly. "You don't know who you're dealing with." And just like that she turned, gathered her things, and left with her entourage. But not before tossing me a glare that said this wasn't over. It wasn't. That night, I sat by the lake, staring at the moonlight rippling over the surface. My father's voice echoed in my memory. "A man's home is his last defense, son. Don't let anyone take it from you, not while you're still breathing." I didn't sleep much that night, and by morning I realized Margaret hadn't just been bluffing, because stapled to my cabin door was an official-looking letter, HOA seal and all, declaring that due to non-compliance with community guidelines. My property was now under review for shared access adjustment. In plain English, she was trying to seize my lake rights, and that was the moment I decided I wouldn't just defend what was mine. I'd destroy her empire. One signature, one lie, one rule at a time. The HOA thought they could bully me into submission. They had no idea I'd spent the last decade working as an attorney specializing in property and water rights law. And Margaret Halbrook? She had no idea the storm she had just awakened. I read that letter 3 times, like staring at ink could make the lie evaporate. The HOA seal looked official enough to make any layperson tremble, and that was the point. Margaret wanted to scare me into silence with bureaucracy, a weapon she knew how to wield. But fear and fury are different animals. Fury sharpens the mind, and mine went immediately to work. I started with the obvious, paperwork. If Margaret thought she could rewrite history with a rubber stamp, I would reply with deeds, surveys, and a paper trail so long it would choke her arguments. My cabin, my shoreline, the easement, everything had been recorded by my grandfather's hand, notarized, contested once during a flood, and defended twice in county court. I had copies of surveys, original deeds, and correspondence dating back decades. I dug each one up, lined them across my kitchen table like the bones of an animal I was about to resurrect, and began to build a fortress out of ink. But legal paper alone wouldn't rattle her inner circle. Margaret's power depended on performance. The polished meetings, the polite dinners, the rubber-stamped consensus that convinced the neighborhood to turn away from messy questions. So I needed to dismantle the theater. I needed to show the neighborhood exactly who she was when nobody polished her nails or smiled politely at her jokes. First, I started quietly. I filed a formal response to the shared access adjustment notice with the county clerk, attaching certified copies of my title, historical easement agreements, and the original grant that explicitly reserved the lake access for my property line. I demanded, in legalese and then in plainer terms, that any attempt to alter my access rights be put on hold until a hearing could be arranged. It was boring and methodical work, the kind that doesn't feel like revenge, but is the safest one to win. While the county did its slow-turning gears, I began to listen. Margaret underestimated the power of listening. She filled her days with statements and declarations, but her emails had a habit of revealing more than she planned. I set up a simple watch. Attend HOA meetings, be present at the coffee socials she liked, and keep a polite, neutral face while my camera, my phone, discreetly tucked in my jacket, recorded. I did not want slander. I wanted proof. Proof of selective enforcement. Proof of personal vendettas hiding behind community standards. Proof that would crumble her facade when laid in front of the right people. The first HOA meeting I attended after the letter masked itself as civil procedure. Margaret, resplendent in a blazer that matched her clipped tone, rose to speak about community values. She walked through a PowerPoint of color palettes and dock safety suggestions like a woman allergic to compromise. When it came to the point about enforcement, she spoke of equity, of holding all members accountable, and smiled at a couple in the front row who nodded in grateful agreement. Her smile was the practiced one, the smile that got her invited to charity galas and allowed her to preside. I kept my questions carefully measured. I asked about the process by which the HOA decided whose lakeside rights would be adjusted and why notices had been sent without prior inspection. I asked for records of votes and minutes. I requested that the minutes be posted publicly. Her calm faltered, just a fraction. It was the only crack I needed. That night, back in my cabin, I began to compile minutes from meetings where parking fines were debated for hours, but where certain members' violations had been quietly waved off. Email chains that showed Margaret pressuring the board to approve community use events that conveniently aligned with her social calendar. And buried a scanned document that made me drop my mug, a private memo recommending that properties not fully in compliance be encouraged to open their access to community events. Euphemism for Margaret's friends using private docks when she wanted them to. I started leaking, but not like a child with a smoldering secret. I leaked strategically. I sent copies of the documents to a local columnist known for exposing small-town hypocrisy. I also emailed sympathetic board members with copies attached and a plain, unemotional note. Are we sure we want to be on the record for this? Some of them shuffled. Some of them panicked. Small-town power is a house of cards, and the wind of scrutiny begins as a whisper. When the whisper reaches the ears of someone who fears being outed as complicit, they often turn into allies. Within a week, the columnist called. He asked gentle, leading questions designed to draw out the story without naming sources. He cared about the rotten teeth of local governance, parking lots, rec center fund misappropriations, the way certain events benefited a few at the expense of many. I answered as if I were talking to a man who needed facts, and handed him more than he expected. We met at a diner outside town, and I left feeling the least like a vindictive man and more like someone who had finally found a tool that cut clean. The article that ran 2 weeks later was a surgical strike. It mentioned allegations of preferential access to lakeside amenities. It quoted from the memos, and it hinted at unusual patterns in enforcement. It did not name me. That was deliberate. I wanted the story to land and for the HOA to flail publicly while I remained the quiet eye. Margaret's reaction was immediate and theatrical. She called an emergency meeting, sent out an email to every resident in the association, with a carbon copy to county officials, and claimed a breach of privacy. The community scrambled into factions. The polite moderates who wanted calm and process, and the angry few who feared the ripple effect of these revelations. Margaret's first public misstep was to call me into that emergency meeting and demand an explanation. It was an audacious move designed to turn the narrative in her favor, make me the interloper. She expected drama. She expected me to respond emotionally, to throw grenades and be the spectacle she could then condemn. But I had learned to let other people's fury animate them while I kept my hands clean. When I stepped into the lodge, the smell of lemon cleaner and expensive coffee filled the air. People looked at me as if I were a storm threatening the picnic. Margaret rose, like a queen whose crown had been dented, and addressed the room with her usual cadence. She called me a liar, a troublemaker, an agitator. I listened. When she finished, I stood and spoke, not loudly, but with a clarity that made even her smile look forced. Everything I've provided to the press in the county is public record, I said. I asked for the minutes and the voting records because I have a right to know how decisions affecting my property were made. If there are rules, let's apply them equally. If there's wrongdoing, let it be addressed properly. But I won't be bullied by insinuations. I will use the law. I will use the record. And if the record shows selective enforcement, then I will make that record public. A murmur rolled through the room. Margaret's face went a strange color, a mix of rage and fear that I'd baited her into. She tried to interrupt, and the board chair, who had always preferred to be neutral, called for decorum. The meeting dissolved into procedural noise and mild accusations, but the seed had been planted. People who had never known the name of the county recorder began to talk about transparency, about fairness. Margaret responded by ramping up the theatrics. More letters, more notices, and a smear campaign of gentle insinuations about my obstructionist behavior. She thought public pressure would be enough to bury me. She miscalculated in one crucial way. She failed to account for history. My father had not only left me the cabin, he had left me lessons. He'd taught me that slow, lawful pressure can sharpen a blade better than a sudden strike. So I set about building allies in the most boring, effective way possible. I organized a homeowner's petition demanding that the HOA publish all minutes and that any decision to alter private easements be subject to a full recorded vote. I reached out to every household within the association and walked them through, calmly and patiently, why transparency mattered. I found people who had been quietly paying fines or who had been told they couldn't host events while Margaret's favored few enjoyed community privileges. Those people were not manipulative or dramatic. They were tired. They wanted fairness, and they wanted their voices heard. The petition gathered signatures faster than I'd expected. I would knock on a door and two things happened. Some residents refused to sign out of fear, but many more, older faces who had been ignored by the board's new clique, took it as permission to speak. They told me stories about preferential treatment, about how Margaret's friends had received exemptions or late fees waived, how Margaret had used the HOA's financial reserves to host a charity picnic that was essentially a private affair. With each signature, the narrative shifted. It was no longer just my fight. It was their demand for a return to integrity. Margaret's response became ugly. She began to use civility as a weapon, calling the sheriff on trivial matters, and filing tiny complaints that forced some of my allies to spend hours in bureaucratic limbo. She sought votes to censure me from the board, accused me of harassment, and urged the community to trust the people who kept things running. But trust, once asked for in the face of evidence, becomes fragile. People started asking their own questions. Why had minutes not been digitized? Why had the community fund declined without transparent accounting? Who exactly benefited from the lake events? The small victories were not cinematic. There were days when I felt like a bureaucratic mole, tunneling through red tape. But slow work has momentum. A county inspector scheduled a visit to my property after my filings. The inspector, a blunt woman with a practical laugh, walked the shoreline, measured the access points, and then asked for documentation. I handed her surveys and she flipped through them with a face that suggested clarity more than judgment. "This is recorded," she said finally. "These are the deeds. The HOA can't override a recorded easement without court order." The inspector's report, when it arrived, was clinical and devastating in its own way. It stated plainly that I held rights that could not be unilaterally changed by the HOA. Margaret's shared access adjustment was based on a misreading of the association's bylaws combined with aggressive interpretation, a legal recipe that had no teeth. Her next move was frantic. She called for a closed-door session of the board and forged an alliance with those who feared the fallout more than they feared the truth. That closed-door session was a mistake. In their rush to find allies, the board released a flurry of internal emails that showed panic, not governance. One of those emails, curious and clumsy, confirmed that Margaret had authorized the use of certain docks for private guests during community events. Another betrayed an eagerness to spin the narrative rather than fix the problem. I had the copies, the timestamps, and the witnesses. Margaret's empire didn't collapse overnight. It cracked the way ice cracks beneath the surface, silently at first, with small tremors you almost miss. It began with whispers. Neighbors who once greeted her with practiced smiles now averted their eyes. At the coffee shop, I'd catch fragments of conversations, people questioning the HOA dues, wondering why the maintenance fund was always low while Margaret's dock seemed freshly refurbished every season. The article had opened a door, but now people were stepping through on their own. Every time someone doubted her, a little of her authority drained away. I kept my distance, watching it all from my cabin porch. Revenge wasn't supposed to be loud. It was supposed to be precise. My father had once told me, the loudest revenge is silence that exposes guilt. And silence was all I needed right now. Then came the first open confrontation. It happened on a Tuesday morning. The HOA board scheduled an inspection of my property, an attempt to reassert their dominance. I expected a few clipboard-carrying volunteers, but when I saw Margaret herself step out of the SUV, heels crunching on gravel, I almost smiled. She looked smaller that day, though she'd never admit it. Her hair was perfectly set, but the way she clutched her folder told me she was on the defensive. 2 other board members followed, faces stiff with discomfort. "Mr. Caldwell," she began, voice formal but brittle. "This inspection is to confirm whether your shoreline modifications comply with community standards." "My shoreline hasn't changed in 20 years, I said evenly. "But you're free to look, as long as you respect property lines." "Of course," she replied, the corners of her mouth twitching. As they walked toward the dock, I followed. Margaret pointed out minor things, a loose railing, some driftwood, the angle of a sign I'd put up that read "Private Property, no trespassing." She made notes, pretending authority. But her words wobbled when she realized I had already repaired everything she could possibly complain about. She wanted confrontation. I gave her compliance so perfect it suffocated her. When they finished, I handed her a folder of my own. Inside were the certified copies of the county inspector's report, the one that validated my private easement and dismissed her shared access nonsense. "You might want to update your records," I said. "It's official. You have no jurisdiction here." She flipped through the pages, color draining from her face. For a long second she said nothing, then closed the folder and thrust it back at me. "You think this makes you untouchable?" she hissed, low enough for only me to hear. "No," I said, meeting her eyes. "It just makes you wrong." Her hand trembled slightly as she turned away. That was the first visible crack. The moment she realized intimidation no longer worked. After she left, the quiet of the lake returned, but it was a different quiet now, the kind that feels like the air before a storm. That evening, I received 3 emails from neighbors, people who had once avoided me, asking about their own property rights, their own fines. I helped them draft letters free of charge. Each one addressed to the HOA, each citing state law and requiring full disclosure of HOA expenditures. By the end of the week, Margaret's inbox must have looked like a minefield, but the crown doesn't fall easily. When the next HOA meeting arrived, she tried to reassert control. Tight smile, polished speech. Yet her words had lost weight. The boardroom chatter was different, people whispering, comparing notes. When I entered, a few nodded in greeting, a small, silent show of solidarity. Margaret tapped the microphone. "Order, please. We have several agenda items tonight, including community maintenance fees and—" A man in the back interrupted her. "Before we start, I'd like to ask where last quarter's surplus went." Margaret froze. "Excuse me." "The maintenance fund," he repeated. "The minutes said we had $8,000 left after repairs. The treasurer's report shows 5. Murmurs rippled through the room. Margaret's smile stretched thin. "That's an accounting delay," she said. "Funds were used for community improvements." "Which ones?" another voice asked. She stammered, a sound I'd never heard from her before. She promised to release a full statement later. But I could see the panic flickering behind her professionalism. She knew the wolves had scented weakness. When the meeting ended, she tried to corner me in the parking lot. "You're behind this," she spat, eyes blazing. "You've been feeding them lies." "No," I said calmly. "Just facts. You're the one who built your house out of fiction." Her expression twisted. "You think you've won? This is far from over." "You're right," I said. "Because I'm not done yet." I walked away before she could reply. My heart was pounding, not from fear, from something else. Power, maybe, or justice finally breathing. But revenge, when tasted, can be intoxicating. It's easy to lose control. And Margaret, desperate and cornered, was about to do something reckless. Something that would expose just how far she'd go to maintain her illusion of control. I didn't know it yet. But that night she crossed the last line she had left. I didn't sleep much that night. The air over Willowmist felt heavier, the way it does before thunder rolls. I sat on my porch with a mug of black coffee that went cold in my hands and watched the reflection of my cabin lights flicker on the lake's surface. Somewhere across the water, Margaret's house glowed like a lantern, bright, defiant, fragile. At midnight, a car's headlights crawled down the gravel road toward my gate. I stood, hand resting on the railing, pulse rising. The car stopped. A figure stepped out, thin, nervous, carrying a stack of envelopes. It was Daniel, the HOA treasurer. "Didn't expect you at this hour," I said. He looked around before answering. "I shouldn't even be here," he muttered. "But I can't do this anymore. She's gone too far." He handed me the envelopes. Inside were copies of bank statements, HOA accounts, months of them. Transfers, withdrawals, and one line that made my jaw tighten. $3,500, event logistics. Vendor, Halbrook and Coburn, Margaret's husband's business. "You have proof?" I asked quietly. "That's everything." She told me to adjust the reports before the next meeting. "And you're telling me because I've got a mortgage and a conscience," he said. "And because you're the only one she's afraid of." When he left, I sat there staring at the paperwork. This was it, the thread that could unravel everything. I scanned and stored every page, then locked the originals in my safe. I knew what to do next. Wait for her to make her next move and let her hang herself with her own rope. 2 days later, her move came. I returned from town to find tire marks on my driveway and the gate chain cut. My stomach sank. Inside, drawers were open, papers scattered, and my laptop was missing. The place hadn't been ransacked for valuables. It had been searched for something specific. I called the sheriff. Deputy Mills arrived, middle-aged, even-voiced, the kind of man who'd seen too many neighbor disputes to be impressed by drama. He took photos, wrote notes, and asked the usual questions. "Anyone you suspect?" "Yes," I said. "Margaret Halbrook." He raised an eyebrow but didn't laugh. "That's a heavy accusation." "Then check her security cameras. The road between her house and mine has one of her fancy HOA surveillance systems." He promised to look into it. When he left, I paced the living room, fury tightening in my chest. She had crossed from politics into crime, and in doing so, handed me the leverage I needed. The next morning, I drove into town and met the same columnist who'd written the first article. I didn't give him the treasurer's documents yet, too early, but I hinted that financial inconsistencies might surface soon. His eyes gleamed. "You have something solid?" "Not yet." "But I will," he smiled. "Then call me the minute you do." That afternoon, the sheriff called back. "Mr. Caldwell, we reviewed the HOA footage. One of the cameras caught a silver Lexus turning down your road at 11:47 p.m. License plate? Registered to a Margaret Hallbrook." The satisfaction that rippled through me was colder than victory. "Press charges," I said. He hesitated. "We'll file an incident report. But you know how these small-town things go. It might not lead to an arrest." "It doesn't have to," I said quietly. "It just has to exist on paper. Because once something exists on paper, it becomes permanent. And permanent records are Margaret's worst nightmare." By the next HOA meeting, the tension in the community had become palpable. Word about the break-in spread fast, though nobody said her name aloud. People whispered in parking lots, avoided her gaze. She tried to keep her chin up, but the tremor in her hands betrayed her. The meeting room was full that night. More residents than usual, many standing along the walls. When she opened the session, her voice carried its usual crispness, but it wavered at the edges. "Before we begin, I want to address recent rumors," she said. "Certain individuals have been spreading false allegations intended to damage the reputation of this board." I leaned back, arms crossed. "All financial matters have been handled transparently and in compliance with association policy. Anyone implying otherwise is misleading this community." I waited until she finished, then stood. "With respect, Madam President," I said evenly, "could you clarify which policies allow transferring community funds to personal businesses without disclosure?" Her eyes snapped to mine, fury barely hidden. "I don't know what you're implying." "I'm implying nothing," I replied, holding up printed copies of Daniel's records. "These numbers do the talking." Gasps rustled through the room. The treasurer sat frozen, guilt all over his face. Margaret stammered, trying to speak, but words tangled in her throat. "That's private documentation." "It's association money," I interrupted. "There's nothing private about it." Someone clapped from the back. Then another. The room turned, the air shifting decisively. She slammed her gavel, shouting for order, but no one listened. For the first time, the Queen had lost her court. After the meeting, I stepped outside into the humid night, my pulse still racing. "Daniel caught up with me. You didn't tell them it was me. You trusted me," I said. "I keep my word," he nodded, relief mixing with shame. "What happens now?" "Now," I said, "she starts to realize the difference between control and power. Control ends when people stop obeying." Later that night, as I drove back to the cabin, I saw Margaret's Lexus parked by the lake. She was sitting inside, motionless, face dimly lit by her dashboard. I slowed my truck but didn't stop. Her empire was crumbling, and she knew it. At home, I poured myself a drink and opened the window. The lake was still, the moon slicing through clouds like a blade. I thought of my father again, how he'd built this place to stand against time, storms and men like her. "You were right." "Dad," I whispered, "a man's home is his last defense." But somewhere deep inside, I also felt something unexpected. Pity. Because I could see what was coming for her. Public humiliation, legal consequences, the collapse of her perfect image, and I knew she'd built her whole identity around it. Revenge gives justice a pulse, but it also leaves a shadow. And as I stared at the lake, I realized the next move would decide not just her fate, but mine. Morning came with a brittle kind of silence. The lake was glass, unmoving, as though the world itself was holding its breath. I brewed coffee, watching mist rise over the water, and for the first time in months, I felt something close to calm. But calm is deceptive. It's the stillness before the avalanche. By noon, my phone was buzzing nonstop. Neighbors, journalists, even the county clerk's office wanted comment. Someone, probably one of the residents from last night's meeting, had leaked the financial records. They'd gone viral on the town's community forum, and within hours, Margaret's name was plastered across local news feeds. The article headline was brutal. HOA President accused of diverting funds for personal gain. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt hollow. Then came the call I'd been expecting. "You think this is justice?" Her voice spat through the phone. "It's the truth," I said quietly. "You humiliated me. You did that yourself." There was a long silence. And then, softer, broken, "You've ruined me." "Jack." The line went dead. I stared at the phone for a while, listening to the emptiness that followed. Revenge never sounds the way you imagine. It's quieter, heavier, more final. 2 days later, I drove into town for supplies. People watch me differently now, some with admiration, others with discomfort. Justice has a strange way of making you both a hero and a warning. At the grocery store, Mrs. Hill from the next cabin approached. "You did the right thing," she whispered. We were all too afraid to stand up to her. "Maybe," I said. "But fear keeps balance. Now there's just chaos," she frowned. "Chaos is still better than tyranny," I wished I could believe her. That evening, thunder rolled over Willowmist. I sat on the porch, the storm clouds swallowing the horizon. Around midnight, a car engine echoed faintly. Headlights appeared, Margaret's Lexus again. I didn't move. She pulled up in front of the gate and stepped out, drenched by the rain. "You shouldn't be here," I called out. "I needed to see it," she said, voice shaking. "The place that ruined me." I walked closer but stayed on my side of the fence. "You ruined yourself," she laughed bitterly. "Maybe, but you handed me the knife." Lightning flashed behind her, a white fracture in the sky. She looked smaller than I remembered, fragile, almost human. "Do you know what they said at the board meeting today?" She whispered. "They're removing me." Effective immediately. "It's what had to happen." "Had to happen," she repeated, like testing the words for meaning. She took a step back, rain streaming down her face like tears. "You win, Jack." Then she turned and walked away. I didn't know it yet, but that would be the last time I ever saw her alive. The next morning, Deputy Mills knocked on my door. His hat dripped rain onto my porch boards. "There's been an accident," he said. "Margaret Halbrook's car was found off Route 16. Looks like she lost control during the storm." For a moment, the world went silent again. The words sank in like stones dropped into deep water. "Is she gone?" he said quietly. "Instant." I closed the door after he left and sat at my kitchen table, staring at my hands. They didn't look like the hands of a murderer. But guilt isn't about blood, it's about weight. And that weight settled on me like lead. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about her last words. "You win, Jack." Was that surrender? Or accusation? I walked down to the dock, the board slick under my boots. The lake was still, reflecting the stars like shards of broken glass. I tossed a stone into the water and watched the ripples spread outward, soft, endless, echoing. Every action we take ripples outward too. Hers had destroyed others. Mine had destroyed her. And somewhere in the middle, justice had turned into vengeance. The days after the accident blurred together. Rain kept falling, steady and unrelenting, turning the gravel roads into rivers of gray. Each drop on my roof sounded like a question I didn't want to answer. The town spoke of Margaret the way people speak of storms, after the damage is done. Some said she'd been reckless. Others whispered she'd been drunk or despairing. No one really knew, and maybe that was mercy. People like a story that ends clean, even when the truth is jagged. I stayed away from the funeral. Couldn't bring myself to watch the same neighbors who once feared her now mourn her. Instead, I walked the shoreline of the lake, boots sinking into wet earth, the wind carrying faint church bells from miles away. When I reached the dock, a bouquet of white lilies floated against the pilings. Someone had set them adrift. I stared at them for a long time, then pushed them gently back toward open water. They drifted off, petals trembling with each small wave. A week later, Deputy Mills came by again. He looked tired, hat in hand. "Town's finally settling down," he said. "Board voted to dissolve the HOA. I blinked. "For good?" "For good. They're transferring maintenance to the county. Guess folks had enough politics." He hesitated before leaving. "She left something for you." He handed me a small envelope, water-stained, my name scrawled in neat handwriting. I waited until he drove off before opening it. Inside was a single note. "You were right about control and power." I forgot which was which. "Take care of the lake. It was the only honest thing we ever shared." No apology. No accusation. Just a confession from a ghost. I kept the note in a drawer, though I read it only once. In the weeks that followed, Willowmist changed. The lake grew quieter without the weekend crowds. The signs forbidding entry were gone, and children started fishing from the shore again. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years stopped by to talk. Somehow peace had slipped back into the cracks where pride used to live, but inside me, something restless remained. Justice had been served, technically, but at what cost? One evening Daniel stopped by. He looked lighter, maybe from the burden he'd carried. "You did what none of us could," he said. "Maybe what none of you should have," I answered. He frowned. "You think you went too far?" "I think I stopped caring where too far started." He nodded slowly. "She wasn't all bad, you know. No one ever is." He left a few minutes later, and I sat by the window until dusk bled into night. Summer slid into fall. The trees around Willowmist burned gold and red, and the lake mirrored every shade. I rebuilt the dock one plank at a time, not because it needed fixing, but because I did. Each nail driven in felt like penance, each creak of wood a reminder that things break and can be mended, just not always the way you want. One evening, as the sun sank low, I saw a pair of kids skipping stones. Their laughter echoed across the water. For the first time in months, the sound didn't hurt. I realized then that revenge had been a storm, loud, consuming, temporary. Justice wasn't about winning. It was about restoring balance, and balance demands silence afterward. I took Margaret's note from the drawer, read it once more, and set it on the fire. The paper curled, blackened, and lifted away in smoke. "Rest now," I whispered. We both earned it. The last of the smoke drifted out through the chimney, disappearing into the evening sky. I stepped outside, feeling the chill roll off the water. The lake was calm again, reflecting only stars. For the first time since the beginning, I felt something simple, almost sacred. Peace. Years slide by quietly when you live beside still water. The storms, the voices, the meetings that once filled every day with conflict, they fade into memory the way ripples fade from the lake after a stone sinks. It's been 5 years since Margaret's accident. Willowmist looks nothing like it did when the HOA ruled every inch of shoreline. The county put in new signs, repaired the roads, and left the rest of us alone. The lake belongs to itself again. My hair's a little grayer now, my hands a little slower. But the mornings remain the same. Coffee steaming on the porch rail, fog rising in pale ribbons, loons calling across the water. Sometimes I still catch myself glancing toward the far side of the lake, where her house once stood. It's empty now, a shell of weathered cedar and cracked paint. The windows reflect nothing but trees. Nature always reclaims what ego builds too high. One afternoon in early spring, a truck stopped at my gate. A young woman stepped out, maybe 22, maybe younger. She had Margaret's eyes. "Mr. Caldwell?" she asked. "That's me. I'm Eliza Halbrook." Margaret was my aunt. I felt the years collapse in a single heartbeat. She said she'd been sorting through her aunt's storage boxes, letters, photos, a few journals. "Most of it's nonsense," she said, smiling sadly. "But there's one entry about you." She handed me a folded page, torn from a notebook. The handwriting was shaky but familiar. He fought me because I forgot why I started. The lake never belonged to me or to him. It belonged to the stillness we both needed and couldn't share. I read the words twice before looking up. Eliza studied me with an expression I couldn't place, part accusation, part gratitude. "She wasn't a monster," Eliza said softly. "No," I agreed. "She was human. And humans break in different directions," she nodded, then glanced toward the lake. "She always said it was beautiful here. It still is." We stood together for a while, silent, watching sunlight scatter across the water. When she finally left, she thanked me, though I'm still not sure for what. That night, I sat by the fire and read the journal page again. The ink had bled in places where rain must have touched it years ago. I realized then that I'd spent too long defining her by the worst of her days, and myself by the righteousness of mine. Maybe justice isn't a verdict. Maybe it's a mirror. I closed the journal page inside an old book on my shelf. Not to hide it, but to keep it safe. Proof that even in conflict, some truths deserve to survive. The next morning, the lake was so still it looked like polished stone. I took my canoe out, paddling toward the center where the water turns dark and deep. From there I could see both shores, my cabin on one side, her empty house on the other. The wind carried no sound, only memory. I set the paddle down and let the canoe drift. Somewhere beneath me, the lake held every reflection, every echo, every secret we'd left behind. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to fix, fight, or win. I simply let it be. Autumn came early that year. The air thinned, the trees burned gold and rust, and the lake began its slow surrender to winter. The nights were sharper, the stars clearer, and the silence deeper than ever before. I'd lived most of my adult life chasing control, of land, of outcomes, of justice itself. But out here, surrounded by nothing but water and wind, I'd learned something the city never taught me, that peace isn't earned through victory, but through release. One evening, I packed a small box, Margaret's note, her niece's letter, and a few photos of the lake from years past. I paddled out to the middle of Willowmist again, the same spot where I'd once thrown stones in anger. The air smelled of pine and smoke. The water was so calm it felt sacred. I opened the box and whispered, "Here's to what we destroyed, and to what we saved." Then I lowered it gently into the lake. The water closed over it without a sound, swallowing history, guilt, and forgiveness all in one breath. The ripples spread slowly outward, perfect circles fading into stillness. For weeks afterward, I felt lighter. I didn't realize how much weight I'd carried until it was gone. I rebuilt the boathouse, repainted the shutters, and started fixing up the cabins around the lake. Not for profit, just for people who needed stillness the way I once did. Sometimes, travelers stopped by, writers, fishermen, wanderers, and asked about the stories the locals told. The HOA feud, the lake that ended it, the woman who fell from grace. I never confirmed or denied any of it. Some truths are better left as folklore. Instead, I told them this. This lake teaches balance. You don't own it, and it doesn't own you. You just share the quiet while it lasts. They usually smiled, nodded, and drifted off down the path, leaving only footprints and echoes. Winter came, and with it, the first snow. I stood at the dock watching flakes melt into the water. The lake didn't resist. It simply accepted. Every storm, every thaw, every season. Maybe that's what redemption really is, learning to accept. Inside the cabin, the fire hummed low. I poured a final drink, sat by the window, and looked out at the frozen ripples of Willowmist Lake. My reflection shimmered faintly in the glass. Older now, but unburdened. "Rest well, Margaret," I whispered. "You finally got your peace." And maybe I did too. Outside, the wind moved softly through the pines, carrying the sound across the water. It was faint, almost musical, like an echo returning home. And in that sound I found what I'd been chasing all along. Not revenge. Not justice. Just silence.